migration. I'm Alexandra Barcelona from Siteport, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be sharing the slide deck with you after the event. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the question panel, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Last, we invite you all to follow along on Twitter with the hashtag Migration101. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Christian Byrne from Siteport, our CTO, and a developer of Siteport. Next, we'll have Dean Barker. He'll be giving the presentation. He's the Chief Strategy Officer of Blend Interactive. Dean is a veteran of over 100 site migrations and has a lot of great insight to share. So with that, Dean, I will pass the baton to you.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We are going to talk about site migrations today. In particular, we're going to talk about how to prepare your site and the things that you can do to make a migration hopefully go smoothly. Just a little bit about Blend Interactive. We are based in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, out here in the Midwest. We specialize in web content management primarily. We implement multiple platforms across multiple languages. We specialize in Episerver. In fact, we were Episerver's first North American partner. We've been doing Episerver implementations for about 7 years now. And just a little bit about Siteport. Siteport, our partners in this webinar, they're based in Long Beach, California. They make migration software. They make automation software. We're going to be talking quite a bit about the role of automation in migrations. And their software supports multiple different content management systems, including Episerver, Ektron, Sitecore, Drupal, and quite a few others. We're going to cover an agenda here quickly. We're going to talk about definitions. We're going to talk about exactly what is a migration in particular. We're going to talk about the things that make a migration complicated, some of the challenges that you're going to find when doing a migration. We're going to talk about the role of automation and how automation might help with a migration. I'll sum up with some of the keys to a successful migration, and then finally we'll have Q&A at the end. And then just a note, this is a very, very wordy presentation deck, and it is that way in particular. There's a lot of words on the screen. There are a whole lot of bullet points. I tried to write this deck so it would stand alone. I know that a lot of people will want to refer to this deck later on, maybe pass it on to other people. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking there are a whole lot of words and a whole lot of bullet points, you're exactly right. It was done that way on purpose. So we'll talk about some definitions quickly. Obviously, a migration is really a movement from one platform to another. And usually this is from a content management system to another content management system. So you're on a system now, you're not happy with that, it's being deprecated, maybe you were never happy with the functionality in the first place and you want to move to a different content management system. Very occasionally, we're actually still seeing static HTML sites that need to move into content management systems. But this is getting more and more rare. Two important terms that I'll actually refer to quite a bit just to standardize these terms. Your source platform is really what you're on now, and your target platform is what you're moving to. That seems obvious, but I'll refer to those terms quite a few times, so it just helps to define those up front. Additionally, I want to clear up the difference between what we call a site migration and a content migration. A site migration would be the movement of an entire website from one platform to another, and this includes the building out of the target platform. So if you're on System A now and you want to move into System B, the entire process of moving from System A to System B is a site migration. A content migration is a subset of that. Once you have your target platform built out, once you have System B ready to go, you have to get all the content out of System A into System B. I'll use an analogy of you live in a house now and you want to move into a larger house. Well, the first thing you have to do is build that house. Once that house is built, you have to move all your stuff into that house. So the entire process of moving into the new house is the site migration. The subset of that, when you're actually moving your furniture into the finished larger home, that would be the content migration. So the site migration is the entire project. The content migration would be a smaller subset of that project. What's important to remember is that you have to re-implement your site in the target platform. And almost unbelievably, this gets overlooked. Some people think that their entire website, everything in their website is really wrapped up in the content. And I've heard people mention several times, if we move all the content, won't it just look and work exactly the same in the new CMS? And the answer is absolutely not. A modern CMS website is really a combination of three things. It's a combination of content, programming, and design. And those things really have to be moved independently. The programming and the design would be the re-implementation of your site in the new platform, and then you would eventually move all the content into that. The fact is all of these things have to migrate and really be rewired in the target platform. So that when you are doing a migration to another platform, just understand you do need to build your site out in that platform. I've said before that the word migration might be one of the more dangerous words in this industry, because some people refer to a migration as the entire process of moving a site. Some people just mean it in terms of a content migration. And I've had situations where someone says, well, we need to migrate to a new site, and they didn't account for the fact they had to completely build their site again in the target platform. There are several different types and degrees of migration. Number one would be a CMS only. So you're on a website now that you're quite happy with. You just want a different content management system. So you really want to rebuild the exact same website, just powered by a different CMS. We call these forklift migrations. And we call them forklifts because what we're doing is basically lifting a website up, sliding a new content management system underneath it, and setting it back down again. That's a gross oversimplification, but we call these forklift migrations. The next step from that would be a CMS and a redesign. So it's the same situation where you do want a new CMS, but as long as you're moving, you think, well, we can redesign the site as well. And this happens quite a bit, and it's fairly efficient since we have to redo templating anyway. With older sites that were built 5 or 6 years ago, we're seeing a lot of people that want to move into a new CMS, and they also want to make the site responsive while they're doing that. And since you have to redo templating anyway, it's a fairly efficient way to do it. And then the third type really might not be a migration at all. It's what we would consider a complete re-implementation. So you want to make fundamental changes to content, architecture, and functionality. And you're essentially doing a ground-up implementation project. It's really kind of a stretch to call that one a migration at all. And so just some examples of what we hear is if someone comes to us and says, well, we love our content, we love our information architecture, we really love our design, we just want a new CMS. This is a site migration project, clearly. They just want to move their content, their architecture, and their design to a new system. And the converse of this would be, as long as we're swapping out the CMS, we want a new design and we hate our content, let's do it all in a new language. This is really just a complete scratch re-implementation. There's really going to be very little shared between the two platforms. So definitions out of the way, we'll talk now about complicating factors, those things that make migrations difficult. And we find what makes a migration complicated is really inversely proportional to how much automation you can bring to bear on the migration. Obviously, the theoretical solution that we're all looking for is that you just press a button and all your content migrates. That's probably unrealistic. You can get fairly close to that in some cases, but the more automation that you can apply, the simpler your migration can be. And the amount of automation you can apply to your migration depends on several different factors. We're going to go over 6 of them here. Volume of content, the velocity of the content, how clean the content is, and then the structure of the content along 2 axes, the discrete structure of the content and the relational structure. And then the reusability of source platform artifacts. When you built your website on the source platform, the one you're on now, you generated several artifacts, the HTML, CSS, a lot of code, and how much can you reuse those? So we'll talk about all of these individually. First of all, we'll talk about the volume of content, and that's fairly important because really the first decision in a migration is, can we automate this at all? So the first decision is to do a manual migration or an automated migration. Manual migrations are fairly rare. The only time you're going to manually migrate a website is when it's very small, maybe less than 50 pages, maybe less than 100 to 200 pages if you have access to cheap labor. So most all migrations these days are becoming automated. If you're doing a manual migration, the volume of content becomes a significant problem because it just becomes a problem of pure manpower. If you're trying to migrate 10,000 pages manually, that can be a huge imposition. If you have a significant amount of content, it fairly well rules out a manual migration at all. The second issue that makes a migration complicated is what we call the velocity of content. The velocity of content is how quickly the content turns over, how fast it's updated. I'll use the example of the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post is a very, very well-trafficked blog, and they probably publish 50 or 100 blog posts a day. That's very, very high-velocity content. Wikipedia is also very high-velocity content. They don't, well, I'm sure they do publish a bunch of new pages a day, but more importantly, existing pages are edited many, many, many times a day. Low-velocity content would be maybe the Library of Congress. The text describing the Declaration of Independence probably hasn't changed in quite a while. So that's fairly low-velocity content that the turnover isn't very high. Low-velocity content makes the migration simpler because it gives you a certain amount of what I'm calling leisure. meaning you can migrate that kind of whenever you want. If I'm going to launch my new site in a year, I could migrate some low velocity pages now, and they won't change between now and a year from now when the site launches. So low velocity content makes it quite a bit easier. High velocity content is more troubling because it really becomes a moving target. If pages are changing every single day and I'm going to launch in a month, well then a page could change 30 times before I launch. And so my only choice is to migrate that content as late as possible. Ideally migrate at the last possible second before I launch. We're going to talk about content freezes later, but high velocity content really compresses your content freeze. You have a problem being in a content free state where you can't let editors edit content on the source platform because they have high velocity changes they need to get in, and so your content freeze window compresses quite a bit. And in these cases, really the only option you're going to have is a highly automated option that limits your content freeze and limits your downtime. Then understand too, when talking about content velocity, the different sections of content on the same website really have differing degrees of velocity. I'll go back to the Huffington Post. They publish 50 or 100 blog posts a day, but I'm willing to bet their privacy policy hasn't changed in several months. So the privacy policy is very low velocity content that can probably be migrated whenever, whereas the blog posts of their main editorial sections are very high velocity and becomes a problem. So we've talked about volume, we've talked about velocity. Let's talk about cleanliness. The fact is a migration is a great time to clean up old non-standard content. We all have a whole lot of content lying around our attic which probably doesn't live up to our standards. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is how dirty is the current HTML? If you are migrating from CMS to CMS and your source CMS is even remotely competent, it's fairly clean. You'd be willing to get fairly clean HTML out of that. The converse to that is static HTML content, in our experience, is just a disaster. Standalone WYSIWYG editors really let people do whatever they want. They enforce no standards. There's no structure. There's no templating. So if you have a static HTML site, I'm willing to bet the content behind that is going to be in rough shape, and it's going to be pretty dirty, and you're going to have to do quite a bit of transformations. And by transformations, I'll give you some examples in a second. We mean that we have to change HTML on the way over. So we really have to reach into the HTML. Alter the tag structure, alter some of the content in the HTML on the way over. We have to ask ourselves, how predictable are the transformations? I'll give you some examples in just a second of very predictable transformations if we're changing one header to another or something like that. A predictable transformation when we know we need to change one tag to another tag, I can script that. Now an unpredictable transformation really can't be automated. If there's an edge case where somebody on this one page inserted this strange tag structure that we need to get rid of, well, that's an edge case. That's an exception that only applies to that page, and that really can't be automated. I'll give you an example here of several content transformations, and these are fairly common that we see. This is an HTML structure. So you have a paragraph tag, and inside there you have a span with a class that surrounds the date line of the article. And we decide on the new website for the new web design it needs to look like this. So what we need to do is we actually need to find those spans of that class, reach in, grab the content, create a new H4 tag, and put it above the paragraph. Now you're thinking, well, I'll just go do this myself. I'll just go into source view in the HTML and move things around, which is fine if you have one page. If you have 10,000 pages, if you have 10,000 news releases that all have this structure, that's going to be a fairly big problem. As another example of a paragraph tag with a class of header, and we want to turn these all into an H4. So we're not moving this tag around. We're just swapping this tag for another. And some other things that we see quite a bit is double line breaks. This used to be a lot of WYSIWYG editors would just put line breaks in. They didn't use paragraph tags, and people want to turn these into legitimate paragraphs. We see a lot of empty paragraphs, placeholder paragraphs that need to come out completely, so you want to remove some tags. Invalid nesting we see quite a bit of. And then the real intractable problem that we see are encoding problems. You see there after the for example, you have a strange character. It's like a Cyrillic character. This is an encoding problem. This was probably done in Unicode, and it's being displayed in ASCII encoding or something like that. So these are transformations that we have to do in these content. So we talked about volume, velocity, cleanliness of the content. And now let's talk about the discrete structure of the content. And by discrete, what I mean is the internal structure of a single content object. So how structured is the content in your source platform? If you were doing your site in Dreamweaver, you've really got no structure at all. If you're doing your site in a custom relational database, you probably have quite a bit of structure. And more importantly, how structured does it need to be in the target platform? And how does this differ from the source platform? If the target platform you're moving to really requires an enormous amount of structure and you have none, that's a problem. If you're just doing a forklift migration, then the structure is probably the same. You're going to map over content objects with the same properties between the two systems. And then finally, how cleanly can you identify and extract individual properties and fields? So if I need to get the publish date of all my content to populate a field on my target platform, can I do that? Can I reach into that and grab that publish date? And here's a quick example. This is just a press release I pulled from IBM's website. And if you see this press release that appears on the page, we can actually, the different colored sections show different amount of structure. We can actually divide this up into 8 or 9 different properties. So that press release can't be migrated just as it sits in the browser. It has to be broken apart into different pieces. All of those pieces probably need to be checked for data types. If I'm going to put the date field into a date field in my new system, it has to be checked to make sure it's a valid date. And then those all need to be migrated over as pieces. And speaking of Siteport, here's an example. There's a screen cap out of Siteport. This is field mapping in Siteport. So you can see up the top in the yellow, they're mapping 2 different pages. They're moving a page type in their source system to a different page type in their target system. And you see down the left column there, it's showing all the properties from the source system and what properties we're going to map them to in the target system. So this concept of discrete structure, mapping over the structure of content objects, can be a problem. And then additionally, we have a relational structure. The relational structure are the relational links between different content items. So the question you have to ask is, how interlinked is our content? And those links can come in many forms. There's spatial hierarchical relationships, ordinal relationships where one piece of content appears after another one, field level references. So if I have an author field on my press release, and that links to an author content object. And then HTML links, actually within the HTML. If page A has a hyperlink inside its HTML to page B, and then we migrate the content, if our URL scheme changes, we're going to have to reach back into page A and any other page that link to page B and change all the URLs. So HTML links can be a problem. So what relationships need to be represented via an import? So when we move the structure over, not just moving individual content objects, but removing the relationship of those content objects. And how easily can those links be resolved? So once we get all the content over there, we have to go through all the content in the target platform, look for links to other content and resolve them, re-hook them up again to the content they were originally linked to. And here's an example. This is just a sample site map for a site. You see you have a product section, you have multiple products, and then for product 1, it has a hierarchy of pages underneath it. We really have 2 different types of relational links here. We have a relationship of ordinality between the products. We've ordered our products. If we're generating our navigation from our products, then clearly we've ordered product 1, and then product 2 comes next, and product 3 comes after that. So we have to preserve that ordinality when we're moving between systems. And then additionally, we have a spatial link between the pages underneath a product. Product has a description page, has a documentation page, and then the documentation page has a user guide and a developer guide. This is a hierarchical sub-branch of a content tree that really has to be preserved. So when we move over these 8 pages, it looks like they have to come over in the new system in the same structure that they were in the source platform. So that's relational structure. And we'll talk about the reusability of artifacts. There's really 3 artifacts you might want to reuse. And these are artifacts that were generated from your original build. Number 1 would be your templating code, the HTML and CMS that you originally put together for the source site. Number 2 would be the content architecture, structure, and navigation. And we'll talk about that again in a second. And number 3 would be the integration code, kind of all the random miscellaneous code that you used on your original build to connect to other systems. So templating code, how reusable is that? If you're not changing your design, it tends to be highly reusable. Templating code exists on 2 levels. The actual templating code, which is probably useless because the new system you're going to might not use, well, it probably doesn't use the same templating system and doesn't use the same content API, so it's likely useless. But then there's the rendered HTML, which is fairly valuable. And the process you would go through the rendered HTML is you would really reverse engineer that into new templating logic in your new system. And here's an example. This is from my own intranet, actually. This is an example of Razor code. Our intranet's built in ASP.NET MVC. And you see that this is HTML interspersed with Razor code. Well, I mean, Razor only works if the new system is also templated in Razor. And additionally, it probably won't even work then because the API used is completely different. But when my intranet comes out in a browser, it looks like this, which is very standard neutral HTML. This is highly reusable because what I can do is I can pull this, I can break it up into include files, I can add the new templating tags, and not have to redo all the HTML, CSS. HTML is neutral. I mean, in an ideal world, HTML is a neutral CMS agnostic representation of what your site should look like. So the rendered HTML can be very valuable. The next artifact we'll talk about is the content architecture. And by the content architecture, what I mean, how is your content structured, and how are you generating things like navigation? You're generating your navigation by iterating over pages in your tree and looking through parent and children pages. Is that how you're doing it? And if that is how you're doing it, how well could we move that to the new platform? If you're not changing your core architecture and the target platform shares core architectural concept, then it might be valuable. And on the next slide, I'll give you an example of this. It will still need to be re-implemented, so you will have to go into the target platform and re-implement it, but the logical questions have been solved, which is fairly important. The logical relationships between content and how they map to things like navigation will have been solved, so really it just becomes a question of codifying this in templating code in the target platform. And here's a perfect example. This, again, is from my intranet. And you see in this picture, this is a menu in my intranet. We're in the policies and procedures section. There's a policy subsection, and there's a list of pages in the policy subsection. And the example here is our navigation is rendered by traversing a content tree for parent, sibling, and child pages. And so in this example, we have, this is the content tree now out of Episerver, which our intranet is built in. And you see we have a policies and procedures section with a policy subsection, and then there's a list of pages underneath that. If we were moving to, say, Easy Publish, this is an example of the content tree in Easy Publish. It's not the same site, it's not the same content, but Easy Publish also implements a very, very strict hierarchical content tree. So what's great about that is that my core architectural concept of generating navigation by iterating this tree will transfer between systems. So now I just need to recreate the tree in the new system, and I can generate my navigation the same way. Alternately, this is a screen cap out of Ektron. Ektron doesn't really have a content tree. It has kind of a nested file and folder structure, and generally in Ektron, you don't generate navigation by iterating around that structure. You have a separate menuing system. So in Ektron, you actually go create explicit menus, and then you bind those menus to content. So it's an entirely different paradigm of generating navigation. And in this case, it just won't transfer. I'm going to have to find a different way to do that. First of all, Ektron didn't really allow sub-content, so I couldn't have pages with immediate child pages. So I'd have to find a way to fix that problem. And then I would have to find a way to take this structure, turn it into menus in Ektron, and bind those to pages. So this is an example of Ektron didn't really share architectural concepts with Episerver. And so if I was moving Episerver to Ektron, I would have to fix that problem. And so that concept of content structure really wouldn't be reusable at all. And then finally, integration code. This is code that's really not CMS code at all. It's to integrate with other systems, to build applications and integrate with external systems. An example, if I was a bank and I had a mortgage calculator, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with the CMS, but it's code that I wrote to create a mortgage calculator. If you're not changing platforms, then you can probably reuse most of this. Of course, if you're changing languages, then all bets are off. If you're moving from .NET to, say, PHP, you're going to have to re-implement that in PHP. But if you're moving from one .NET system to another, there's a very good chance that most of the logic of that code can come over. So those are things that make a migration difficult. If you're on the complicated side of a lot of those factors, then your migration is going to be more complicated. Let's talk about some of the business challenges. These are things as a project manager or a web editor that you're going to have to deal with. The biggest one, which we'll talk about at length, is minimizing the editorial disruption. It's like moving a house. It's very, very disruptive to people who are working on the CMS. Managing QA and managing stakeholders during a migration is important. When we talk about editorial disruption, the biggest disruption is going to be the content freeze. The content freeze is the period when editors are prohibited from changing content on the source platform. So you are moving to the new platform. You started moving content, but you haven't launched on the target platform yet. So you're in this kind of in-between zone where you have content in both systems. Now the problem is if your editors keep changing content in the source platform that's already been migrated, then that content's either going to have to be migrated again, or you're going to have to replicate those changes in the target platform. So they go fix a typo in the source platform. Well, that content's already been migrated, so they need to go fix that typo again on the target platform. Content freezes, the only way to describe them is precarious. They're very stressful to the organization. When you have your foot in one of each of two CMSs, that's very, very stressful to your editors and is hugely disruptive. So the biggest thing that you want to manage from a business standpoint is how can you minimize this content freeze. When you're doing an automated content migration, you have a cycle that you go through. It's really an iterative process. So you have content in your source platform. What you do is you do what I would call a test migration. You hook your migration software up and you migrate your content to your target platform, and then you review the results. What worked, what didn't. You do a quick QA, you find some problems with the migration, you adjust your migration, and then you remigrate. And while you're doing this, all the content on the target platform is really disposable. You overwrite it every single time. And for very complicated migrations, we might go through this cycle 20 or 30 different times, changing things, finding problems in QA, fixing our script, and simply remigrating. Now, if we find a problem with a page, and we find there's 10 pages that have the same problem, maybe a tag structure didn't come over right, an image is missing, we won't change that on the target system. We will change our script to remigrate it, because if we change it on the target system, then that content is effectively locked in the target now. It's been changed, and so we will change our migration script and then remigrate the content. But you're going to get to a point where you run into the limits of your migration software. You're going to get to a point where you really can't fix the content anymore in an automated fashion. When you hit the limits of this, you really have to commit to that content in the target platform. So when you have gone through your migration cycle multiple times, you've got the content as clean as you can from an automated standpoint, you really have to commit and you have to make a decision. Do you launch with content that's less than perfect and fix it after launch, or do you implement a content freeze? Do you tell your editors, okay, we've done an automated migration, that's the final automated migration, we have about 3 days of cleanup we have to do, so don't change any content on the source system. This is a real problem. Content freezes are very, very stressful, and if you have a lot of high velocity content, you're telling all your editors, stop changing content while we clean this stuff up. The other thing you want to do is you very much want to minimize QA. After you move content into the new system, it really has to be quality checked. And this usually requires domain knowledge. You can quality check some things, like did images break or other obviously patent problems with content. But a lot of times you have to get people, domain experts in your website and the content of your website, to review the content in the target platform and ensure that everything migrated correctly. This can be expensive in terms of time. Depending on your industry, a domain expert that is qualified to review this content might be fairly expensive on a time basis. And the fact is, if your automated software is not very good, you're going to have less fidelity. And less fidelity generally means more QA. So minimizing QA is very important. And finally, from a pure organizational standpoint, managing stakeholders. During content migrations, stakeholder and organizational management can be one of the more difficult things. Because the fact is, when somebody hears the site is migrating, everybody will want input. Depending on the scope of the changes that you're making, everybody has their own pet project that they think, well, the site's migrating, we should get this in now. I've always wanted to do X with the website, and now is a perfect time. So you will have feature requests coming out of the woodwork by people that want to get their feature in while the content is migrating. And questions of whether or not to migrate content X, any particular piece of content, become very, very politicized. When you say, well, you know, we've looked at the analytics and nobody's really using this section of contents, we've decided to remove her from the site and we're not going to migrate that content. That can sometimes unleash a firestorm of controversy inside your organization. Because what I have learned is that for every bit of content functionality in your source platform, someone is likely expecting it to be on the target platform. And if it doesn't migrate from the source to the target, somebody is going to complain. So managing stakeholders is a very, very important part of doing a content migration. So that are the business challenges, and what we're going to talk about now is really the role of automation. Unless you have a very, very small website, you're going to have to migrate, or you're going to have to automate the migration process. So there are different automation platforms. Siteport makes a good one. They're partners in today's webinar. And we're going to talk about why automation works and what it really enables you to do. The first thing that automation does is it helps you speed up the migration cycle. If you remember from a few slides back, we talked about you test migrate your content, you review the results, and then you adjust the results. What a competent migration platform lets you do is speed up that cycle so you can iterate that cycle faster. You can review your results faster, you can make changes faster, and you can re-migrate the content. Additionally, it helps standardize the migration. So what you can do is you can test your migrations very early in the process and then run them with confidence later in the process. You could prototype a migration, iterate through it several times, get it exactly where you want it, and you can be confident that when you're actually ready to go 6 months later, you can migrate the content in the exact same way. Finally, content transformations can be fairly difficult. When you're reaching in and rearranging HTML, that can be a problem. Automation platforms really allow you to transform the content well during a migration. You can clean up a lot of your old CSS, a lot of your old HTML by transforming this content. And finally, and this is fairly important, is that automation platforms handle the rote movement of bytes. I always think of this in terms of bytes on disk. What a lot of people overlook is that at some point, regardless of all the planning you've done, all the transformations you've designed, the fact is that at some point, bytes on disk from your source platform are going to have to be written to a disk on your target platform. And some people sort of overlook that somebody is going to have to write a script or an API to actually move bytes between the two systems. And this is what automation platforms do, is they really handle the rote movement of bytes between the two systems. Now, if you remember one slide for this entire webinar, it's this next slide, because I think this next slide sums up in a perfect world how a migration would work and what a competent automation platform will allow you to achieve. It'll allow you to retrieve what we call the push-button migration. In a perfect world, you're looking to bottle your migration. So if you decided you want to move to a new CMS, it's going to take you 3 months to build out that content in a new CMS. After 1 month, you can get access to it to start test migrating content. So what you start doing is you crack open your migration software and you start test migrating content. You start going through your automated migration cycle where you migrate the content over, you adjust it, you migrate it again, you adjust it again. In a perfect world, you get to the point where this migration is absolutely perfect with no errors. That you can now press a button and migrate all your content from one system to the other. Now, you don't do that right then because you may not be ready to launch and your editors are still changing content on the source platform. You want to migrate as a general rule. You want to migrate at the last possible minute to pick up the last latest changes from the source platform. If you have a good automation platform, you can bottle these migrations and achieve what we call the push button migration. So you push a button, the actual technical movement of bytes. So the process of taking bytes from the source platform and writing them to the target platform might take just a few minutes. I mean, longer migrations of tens of thousands of pages might take several hours to run. But if you just are moving bytes from one system to another, that might just take a few minutes. What that means is that your content freeze only lasts minutes. You tell people at 10 a.m., hey, we're going to migrate the websites now, stop editing, and by 10:15 you launch and you say, okay, everybody go to the new website and start working there. If you can get your content freeze down to 10 or 15 minutes, you are doing phenomenally well. And a very, very good automation platform can let you get there. Now the preparation, we talked about the movement of bytes from one system to another. That might take just minutes. The preparation for that moment might take months. You might have someone working for quite a bit of time to absolutely perfect that migration. How long that takes depends on how good your automated software is, and it depends on how much you're changing your website on the way across. If you are doing a forklift migration and you have a very good piece of software that understands both platforms, so Siteport, for instance, supports both Ektron and Episerver. So if you're moving from Ektron to Episerver and you have Siteport, Siteport understands both of those platforms. And so Siteport can automatically move content and structure from one platform to another. And so if you do that, it might take you a week to prototype that migration. Then you've really bottled that migration, and you can do a push-button migration 15 minutes before you launch. And it goes without saying, push-button migration is only possible with automation. If you're migrating content manually, you are going to have a significant content freeze. Finally, what an automated migration platform offers you is manageability. Large parts of a migration fall into patterns which don't need to be resolved. I showed you screen caps a while back of transformations, HTML transformations you might want to do. I have those as kind of a library because these are problems that we've solved over and over again. We see the same patterns over and over and over again. Large parts of a migration fall into patterns, and migration automation platforms have solved these problems. They don't need to be resolved. Additionally, as a migration becomes more complicated, management of the migration scripts becomes a bigger and bigger problem. Very complicated migrations moving between very disparate platforms involving a lot of content transformations. The code to do those migrations could potentially be more complicated than the code to actually run the website. And what's sad about this is code that you're going to throw away. After you've migrated, you're going to throw this code away. You don't want to be writing this code yourself. It's extremely complicated. It's only used one time, and then you toss it away. That is a huge, huge development investment for something that's really not going to provide value to the organization after that migration is complete. The goal is a predictable, repeatability of iterations. When we go back to the automated migration cycle, the goal is that you can run a migration cycle, adjust, run it again, and predict the results and know what you're going to see. What you want to avoid more than anything is a confusing mess of one-off scripts. If you have one guy in the corner of your development environment says, well, I'll just write a Perl script to move all this content, that's going to be a mess. And what's worse than that is when you have a single person that knows how it all works. And what's even worse than that is that person leaves the organization halfway through the migration. You don't want that. You don't want a bunch of one-off custom scripts to migrate your content. So that's the role of automation. We're going to talk about the keys to a successful migration. So these are the things that you really need to concentrate on to migrate your site successfully. First of all, you have to do an absolutely ruthless content inventory. This is an editorial and organizational question, and as I said before, this can get highly politicized. But the fact is, the easiest way to migrate a piece of content is to not migrate that piece of content at all. Everybody's website has content that nobody's using and can probably go away. Intranets in particular the average intranet could drop 80% of its content without a problem. You really need to start looking at your analytics and start looking at your content and figure out, do you really need to migrate everything? Every piece of content you don't migrate will make your migration less complicated and take less resources. So do a fairly ruthless content inventory. Limit scope if possible. If you are running a migration, be very, very careful when stakeholders start coming out of the woodwork wanting to do A, B, and C. If they say, well, I want to make this change on the new website, understand that you have to scope that on two levels. You have to scope the actual change that someone has to code in the implementation on the new website, but you also have to scope that in terms of how that affects your migration. If somebody comes to you and said, I've never liked how this content is structured, I'd like to change this on the new website. Well, even if that's a simple programming change on the new website, you have to now change your content on the way over. It has to be transformed and rearranged. That can get expensive. So very much limits scope. If you can get away with doing a forklift migration, just swapping in a new CMS on your current website, and tell everybody after we get this moved and we're up and running on the new CMS, on the new target platform, we'll look at your changes then. If you can do that, you'll be a lot better off. Get enough organizational backing to effectively manage stakeholders. When people come out of the woodwork and they want all of these different changes to their content and to the website, make sure that you have the organizational power to say no. Make sure that you have some C-level executive in your back pocket that you can refer sticky questions to. If you don't have organizational backing, you can get abused by people higher up the org chain than you are. What they can do is they can start asking things that make your migration very, very complicated, and you just don't have the power to tell them no. Number 4, find a competent automation solution. There are several out there. Siteport is a very good one. I do not suggest you do manual automations. I do not suggest you one-off and write custom scripts for these migrations. Find a competent automation solution that lets you iterate through the migration cycle faster and be able to predict the results. You're trying to get to a push-button migration. There are platforms that will enable you to do this. Over-allocate time and budget. The one constant we find about migrations time and time again is they're absolutely under-budgeted in terms of expense and time. We have been involved in projects that really weren't website development projects. They were really migration projects with a small development cycle attached to them. I have seen projects where the migration costs were over half of the budget. In general, a migration will take longer and cost more than you think it will. Make sure you over-allocate in that respect. Now, we talked about minimizing the content freeze. If you do have a content freeze, ensure enough resources are available. This should be an all-hands opportunity for the organization. When you are in a content freeze and you are QAing content, you are trying to get launched and you are telling people don't edit, you cannot have half your editorial staff on vacation. Make sure that this content freeze is planned far in advance and everybody knows the third week in October we are migrating the website. Nobody can take time off. Shed all your other responsibilities for this week. You need to be available to QA your content and help us make manual adjustments before we launch. Just understand that content freezes are extremely stressful. Obviously, we said before, the goal is to minimize freezes as much as possible. But if a freeze is unavoidable for your organization, it will be an order of magnitude more difficult unless you have everybody available to help you end that freeze and get launched. So those are the keys to a migration. We've gone over a whole lot of information. We would love for you to contact us both at Blend Interactive and Siteport. We would be happy to demo our services and products for you. So if you'd like to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it back over to Alex to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Dean. That was awesome. That was some great information. We do have a couple of questions in here. One that we got, just a reminder to everyone, we did record this and we will be sharing the information with you later, so you will have it to review. Okay, so let's go into some questions. The first question, I think this one will be for Christian from Siteport. So how does Siteport handle content migration when you're getting rid of your old templates and redoing the new look and feel of your site?
So hi everyone, this is Christian. So that's a use case that's pretty common with content migrations, as Dean was mentioning. It's a redesign scenario. So in that scenario, you or your implementer would be building those templates directly into your target CMS. And designing them however you want to design them, deciding what the content structure and the editable content fields should be. And then you use Siteport. Within the Siteport tool, you can map your fields from your old system, your old templates, and migrate them into your new template. So as the content gets moved from the source to the target, Siteport is able to instantiate pages or articles or whatever the content type is in the new system and make sure that the content is put into those fields in your target CMS.
Okay, thank you very much. This next question, I believe, Dean, this one is for you. How do you rebuild the navigation when the content hierarchy changes?
Well, if you're using implicit navigation, so if you're generating your navigation based on the content hierarchy, you really are working in terms of what I would call rules. So you're saying the left navigation of, when you're looking at a page, the left navigation will be formed out of the child pages to this page. As long as that rule stays constant, then it doesn't matter if the actual content gets shifted out in the hierarchy, because the rule is that the left navigation will be the child pages of the page that they're looking at. And that rule holds true no matter what actual content is slotted in what place in the content tree. Now, if you're changing the rules, if you're fundamentally changing how you're going to generate navigation off of the content tree, then that's just going to have to be recoded. I mean, you are changing the logic. We talked about the reusability of artifacts. And one of the artifacts from your original build was the content structure and logic. If you are changing the logic of the rules or how that's going to be generated, then you will have to recode that. But if the rules are constant and you're just changing where content goes in the hierarchy, this may be an oversimplification, but you shouldn't have to change much.
Okay, thank you, Dean. We actually have another question I think that will be good for you. What do you recommend for an organization migrating from static HTML and Dreamweaver? Should they do a complete overhaul?
It depends how clean your HTML is. It really does. Dreamweaver is probably going to let a lot of people do a lot of things. The HTML is probably going to be very dirty, require a lot of transformations. Additionally, there's really no API to static HTML. So for instance, if we're going into, say, Episerver, well, Episerver really runs off a strong content tree. How can we derive a content tree from static HTML? Well, you could look at the folder structure. You could start iterating through the folders. So you could go to a folder and you could look for the default page, the index.html in that folder, and then you could make that a page in Episerver. And then all the other pages in that folder might logically be children of that page. If that doesn't hold true, you could theoretically parse the navigation. So find a sitemap that lists the pages in a hierarchy. Parse the HTML and derive that structure from that. Your biggest problem going from static HTML, well, your two biggest problems, number one is going to be deriving the structure of the website. Most new competent CMSs are going to have a content tree as going to be their main content structure. So deriving structure from static HTML will be fairly difficult. And number two, the quality of HTML, if you're doing a static site, I'm willing to bet is not fantastic, and you might have to do quite a bit of cleanup. Can be done. We've done a number of them. Every one is different, but structure and transformations are going to be your biggest problems there.
Great, thank you, Dean. And we have one last question here. I think this one is best for Christian. Ektron has content in large areas of text. In our redesign, we're making editable content much more granular. How should we handle that?
That's a good question. So yeah, Ektron, one of the patterns in Ektron is for it to force you to put a lot of your content into a large block, one large text area. So one thing that you can do in Siteport is you can map that single large text area to multiple fields. When you're moving your content over to Episerver, you'll probably want to make your content more granular so that you have better content reuse, so that you can personalize different areas of the page for different things. You know, if you want to take advantage of those capabilities in Episerver, you need to break your content down into much smaller bites. And using Siteport, as the content comes through, if you have 10,000 article pages that all have the content in one large area, one large block area of content, you can tell Siteport to map that one large block into multiple fields inside of Episerver, so that you have the ability then to personalize the image to the user as they come to the system, or personalize the headline or some other part of the content as it gets moved over into Episerver.
Thank you, Christian. So it looks like those are all the questions that we have for today. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can contact Blend at blendinteractive.com or Siteport at siteport.net. And thank you again to Dean for this awesome presentation. And thank you to all of you for joining. We look forward to speaking with you soon.